is Thursday, the 4th of March, 2021, and you're listening to Skeptics with a K, the podcast for science, reason, and critical thinking. Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, a non-profit organisation for the promotion of scientific skepticism on Merseyside, around UK and internationally. I'm your host, Mike Hall. With me today is Marsh.
Hello.
And Alice.
Hello.
So listeners probably, well, may or may not be aware, depending on whether they follow me on Twitter, that I'm out of work at the moment. The company that I've been working for, we've mothballed, and so I'm currently wandering around looking for a job, trying to find a new job, doing a new job. Let's get a new job, which is a long time since I've had to properly go out and look for a new job. But one of the things I've found particularly frustrating and experience about it is the number of jobs. There was one company that wanted me to go and basically build all of the spyware tools that I've been railing against on this show for the last year and a bit, of saying, we shouldn't be spying on people. This is a bad idea. Customers don't like this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And their whole business was building those tools to help influencers build their brands and track where their fans are from, and, et cetera, et cetera. And they did that by feeding all of that information back to all of those third parties. And so I refused to interview. They said, we'd like to interview, and I refused to interview on the basis of the fact that the work that they were doing, I felt was unethical.
Nice.
Frustratingly, one of the things that really put me off about it was their own website, their actual website, was in violation of GDPR because it was setting tracking cookies without consent from the customer. It was just going ahead and doing it. It's like, well, that's a great indicator of how you view this stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to do that. So in the meantime, I've been cooking.
Okay. Is this? Yeah. You've made more croissants?
while you're looking for a job, you are cooking. Mike's still living in lockdown 1, isn't he? He was too busy working in lockdown 1. He's now
he's on his banana bread,
having a go at lockdown 1 again.
I have done a banana bread, but the thing that I've done most recently is meringues. I made meringues.
Is that just so you can do your Geordie joke, or do you want a cake and meringue?
I did the Geordie joke on Twitter. Nobody got it.
No.
I don't get it. I'm sorry.
You've got to be Geordie.
I saw it when you put it on Twitter and I didn't get it, and I didn't ask you. So you can explain it on air now.
Don't explain it.
You cannot explain the joke. The joke cannot be explained. Meringue?
No, you eat.
But I made meringue nests. And that was quite nice. I made a little compote, a little mixed berry summer fruit compote.
That's just like a jam, isn't it?
Yeah,
like a weak jam.
Yeah, it's a mushy jam. But I made a little compote that went thing. I whipped some cream.
Okay.
This came up over Christmas Day. Christmas Day, my sister-in-law said, "Oh, I've got some whipped cream," and just got out some whipping cream from the fridge. I just poured it over a mince pie. And I said, "That's not whipped cream.
That's just cream.
That's whipping cream." And she said, "Well, what's the difference?" I said, "You need to whip it." And so then sat there with a whisk for 6 minutes going whisk, 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 whisk. And then suddenly, as happens when you're whipping cream, it just suddenly goes boom, and it's whipped cream.
Yeah, it's like a totally solid cube of like a solid unit of cream. Yeah.
And everyone was remarkably astonished. So I whipped some cream for my meringue nests as well. And I'm very happy with it. I'm very, very proud. So that's me. I've been job hunting and cooking. How are you folks doing?
I'm all right, but I've done something to my shoulder, something unknown to my shoulder. I was doing some general exercise. I did a bit of running and I did a bit of exercise biking, all fine. I did a little bit of weights. I was doing some sort of free weights and stuff, and I did that for, I'd say, about a fortnight or maybe slightly longer, and now I've knackered my right shoulder. Specifically, it's when you do essentially the walk like an Egyptian.
Okay.
If you sort of raise your arm to a right angle and then rotate it up, that's when it feels like my shoulder's currently coming out of joint. And so I'm sporadically wearing this sling that Alice has lent me.
I have me used to this with all my joint issues.
You do. Although I'm worried at the moment that the sling is just pulling my shoulder over and therefore further out of joint.
Yeah, you've not tied it right then.
Yeah, so I'll abandon the sling for the duration of the cold, and I'll try and sort it after. But yeah, that's a bit annoying. I keep reaching for things. It's my right arm. I do lots of things with my right arm. I like reach and write and use a mouse and stuff, and I keep reaching for them and going, yeah.
Yeah, it's really annoying, isn't it?
Have you considered amputation?
I did actually consider amputation. Nicola said I probably shouldn't look into that just yet.
I mean, it's an extreme solution, but it does solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, not necessarily. It neither necessarily solves the problem, because phantom limb is a thing, And it would only potentially solve the one problem of the pain.
Yeah, that's the point, though. It solves the problem. It introduces a series of other problems.
Well, but it doesn't necessarily.
Probably solves the problem, but Alice is right. You could get phantom limb shoulder pain, and then you're like, ah!
I cut off my own arm at the shoulder for nothing.
You're a fool to yourself, Marsh.
I don't even get the one benefit I was looking for. Well, actually, leading on from what have I been up to, last Tuesday, 23rd of February, I got a text message at 2 p.m. from my GP surgery, from my doctor, my general practitioner. And it said, "Dear Mr. Marshall, we'd like to invite you to book your appointment for your COVID-19 vaccination. If you're able to, please click this link and make your appointment within the next 24 hours. If you can't, don't worry, the practice will contact you to arrange something." This was a complete surprise for me. An absolute shock, in fact, because at the time, I think the government was saying that everyone would be vaccinated by mid-July. I think they just announced the day before, basically, or that was kind of the time to look at.
Yeah.
Prior to that, they were saying October. They moved that to mid-July. And then as a pretty healthy, barring the shoulder, 37-year-old, I was assuming that I wouldn't be vaccinated till like June or something like that. That's what I had in my head. I would use those online calculators. That's it. If you're vaccinating this many people per week and you're these different kind of categories about yourself that you can expect to be vaccinated in 2027 or whatever the hell it was. So I was thinking June. June would be the earliest they would get it.
I mean, I should be getting it before you. I'm older than you are. We're both 1,000 years older than Alice.
Exactly.
You know, I should be getting the vaccine first. So I think this is unfair. This is not right. I'm going to write to the Daily Mail.
This is exactly my wife's reaction to me getting the vaccine. It wasn't oh, that's good news. It's a, what? Hang on. Why are you getting it? I'm older than you. So
I mean, I should be ahead of both of you.
Yeah, you should. But for those who aren't aware, listeners outside the UK in particular, the government here is rolling out vaccines nationally according to a priority list of at-risk groups. So priority 1 is residents in care homes for older adults or staff who are working in the care homes for older adults. Priority 2 is if you're 80 or over, or if you're a frontline health and social care worker. Priority 3 is 75 or over. Priority 4 is 70 or over, plus the clinically extremely vulnerable group. Priority 5 is if you're 65 or over. And priority 6 is 16 to 65 if you're in an at-risk group, which is in a list of very specific conditions. I wouldn't expect to be getting vaccinated until priority 10, which is rest of the population, which is everybody below 50, basically. They have priority groups going all the way down to 50 and then all the rest of you buggers. So it's very age-based unless you have one of a list of conditions. And the conditions include cancer, diabetes, dementia, heart, kidney or liver disease, breathing difficulties, lowered immunity due to an existing treatment, learning difficulties, mental illness, rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or a couple of others.
Autism? Is autism on there? Can I skip the queue?
Only if if it severely hampered your life, I think.
So yes. Yes, it is.
Well, actually, we'll come to something similar to that a little bit, actually. But basically, none of those things described me. The closest of those that you could possibly say describe me at all was that when I was round about 6 years old, they thought I might have asthma. So they gave me an inhaler. And then they realized it wasn't asthma, and then they took the inhaler back away again, and I've been fine since. And in retrospect, I think that was probably allergies, because I've got like respiratory allergies that I get, hay fever, basically, and it's a bit of a pain. Didn't get that diagnosed of that until I was in my late 20s, so it might have been allergies as a kid, and they just didn't bother giving me an antihistamine or something. So, yeah, it was a massive surprise, a shock even, to be invited for a vaccine. And I honestly, really genuinely was not sure what to do. Because obviously, I want to be vaccinated, because who wouldn't want to be vaccinated? There's a panda one. Mm-hmm. Vaccine's pretty cool. This one seems pretty cool. But the last thing I wanted to do was to jump the queue at all or anything like that. I didn't want to be in a risk of that.
Nothing else, so you're going to wind Nicola up.
Yeah, exactly. I don't mind jumping the queue ahead of Nicola, but anybody else, then it would be a problem. I essentially thought that bit in the text where it said, make an appointment within the next 24 hours, seemed a really interesting thing to say, because I'd read elsewhere that Liverpool was using the Pfizer vaccine at the moment. There'd been a shipment of Pfizer vaccine, and that was what large parts of Liverpool were administering. And so I figured that's maybe why they were asking for people to come and get vaccinated immediately. Famously, the Pfizer vaccine has to be stored at like a super cold temperature. And once the whole batch is thawed, you've got to then use it all up. It doesn't last. You've got to use it that day. And I'd even read stories elsewhere about vaccine units being thrown away because they'd expired, because they just couldn't get them into enough arms in time.
Yeah. Although I think Pfizer have said, actually, in hindsight, it does work fine at a normal fridge temperature, and they're trying to apply to have their license changed so that they can be distributed just at normal fridge temperature.
Oh, I've not seen that.
But this is over in the US. They're trying to persuade the FDA. They present the evidence to the FDA, and actually, it's fine. It's fine at a normal fridge. Can you expand our license? Which I think is jealousy.
Yeah, it's like, well, we were the first one out, but actually, these are the ones seem a bit better now.
Yeah,
in different ways. So there was a link in the text message to book the appointment and stuff. And so I thought I'd click that to find out more. And it offered me 3 different vaccine centres with which to make an appointment either the same day or the next morning. And the closest vaccine centre to me was the one on Park Road in Liverpool. And that had no appointments at all either day. So it said, make an appointment within 24 hours, give me that list. But actually, there wasn't any appointments free at that facility. And the next closest to me as well had no appointments either. The only one that had any appointments was in Kensington, which is just north of the university campus.
You say Kensington, known locally as Kenny.
Known locally as Kenny. Very different from the London Kensington.
Very different
from the London Kensington.
Whereas the London Kensington is one of the most affluent areas in the country, the Liverpool Kensington is one of the least affluent areas of the country, one of the most deprived areas in the country, I think, in most of the measures that come up. It had 3 appointments available, one for 2:50 p.m, so 50 minutes after they text me, and I'd spent some time trying to figure this out as well. One for 4:40 that afternoon, and one for the next day. So this definitely felt to me like, look, we've got a vaccine, we've got the Pfizer vaccine, we've booked all the slots we can, but we've got some vaccine left, we need to use it today, we need an arm to put it in. That's what it felt like their situation was. Of course, this might be motivated reasoning entirely on my part, because as I say, I was motivated to get vaccinated. But I'd also seen some other pretty encouraging stats around Liverpool's vaccine rollout, because I'd seen other people subsequently saying that maybe some different parts of the NHS were administering vaccines this way because they'd had low take-up in some of the older groups, and so they'd made it through more of the older groups who were willing to get it faster than you were expected. But that, I don't think, is the case in Liverpool, certainly. The stats that I saw as of the 18th of February was there have been 122,679 COVID vaccinations, first shots, given across Liverpool, which isn't bad given Liverpool has a population of about 500,000, under 500,000. So it's like a quarter of the population in Liverpool had received a first shot already, which is, pretty decent. Of those vaccinated, 90% of everybody over the age of 75 had taken a vaccine. So not 90% of the people they'd approached over the age of 75, but 90% of the over 75 population in Liverpool had taken the vaccine. 88% of those between 70 and 74, 64% between those 65 and 69, and 76% of all clinically extremely vulnerable people in Liverpool had all taken a vaccine, plus 2,204 care home residents and nearly 14,000 frontline workers. And that was the week before I got a text. That's like 4 or 5 days. And obviously they were still doing pretty good numbers each of those days subsequently. So Liverpool had already covered a pretty impressive chunk of categories 1 to 6 there. And they were asking for someone to be available within 50 minutes, which I couldn't have made, and someone else to be there within 3 hours. So I booked a 3-hour slot, figuring that if they didn't fill it, there's a chance it would go to waste. And the chances that from someone from one of those higher groups could just drop everything and get there seemed smaller. The fact that not only were they able to be reached in that time, but then to be able to drop it and get to there in time and get to Kenny in time seemed smaller than me, a guy who works from home and has a car. It seems pretty unlikely that the vaccine they gave me could have gone to someone in a care home or someone over the age of 80 if I didn't get it. I think it's unlikely that they'd have gone, fuck it, we'll take this particular vaccine. We're not using it here. We're going to drive to the nearest care home and stick it in someone. But this is also something I've been thinking about for a little while after I heard of 2 stories of of actual errors in the invitations for vaccines. One of them was a story of Liam Thorpe, the political editor of the Liverpool Echo.
He seems to be like, we collectively talk about Liam Thorpe quite a lot because he is like the local Liverpool Echo news reporter. Every single article that is about Liverpool is written by Liam Thorpe. Yes. It seems like he's their only journalist. He writes everything. I think it turns out he's like basically the only one who's actually based in Liverpool, and half the other Echo staff are based like over in Manchester. So he does all the Liverpool stuff for the Liverpool Echo. But yeah, his
name does come up an awful lot. And I notice it because it's very similar to my wife's name, but specifically different in terms of the Thorpe and Throp kind of bit. But yeah, he was very confused to be offered when he got a text offering him the vaccine a couple of weeks ago, because he's 32 years old and in pretty good health. So he called his doctor to ask what was going on. And he found it's because of he actually had a very high BMI, body mass index. His BMI was 28,000.
That's quite high.
Yeah. Like, for context, a BMI of 40 is considered on that scale to be morbidly obese. And there are problems with the BMI as a scale, but 40 is a line where they say morbidly obese, and he was 28,000. So even if you said, actually, the BMI is a problematic scale, nobody's disputing that a BMI of 28,000 would still be indicative of an issue. And the issue specifically it was indicative of was that while his medical records had his weight correct, they had his height recorded as just 6.2 centimeters rather than 6'2". So they thought he was just shorter than 3 inches, but still weighed the same amount as an average 32-year-old man.
Yeah, I don't remember that bit in Tom Thumb.
So obviously that was an error, and that's why he was put in a higher category, because a BMI that high would put you as a clinically vulnerable person who was at risk and therefore would be eligible for the vaccine. And he corrected it, and I don't believe he got vaccinated.
And just from a technology perspective, almost certainly what happened there is someone's done something like an SQL query on the data set to say, select all patients with a BMI greater than 40.
It's 40, yeah. The cutoff is 40.
And this person will have just dropped out on the list. And no one's actually read the line that says 28,000 and gone, wow, we better get Tom Thumb in. Because, you know, no one's actually read that. It's just he's come out on a list in a database query.
Yeah, and equally, the database that his height was input into either was in metric when he needed imperial, or it had both and somebody's filled in the wrong section of it.
Yeah, it's probably one of those, because I've seen the kind of boxes. There'll be one where is that input it in metric or input it in imperial, and they've typed it in the wrong box. And they've put a 6 and a 2, but it's not meters and centimeters, it's feet and inches.
But there's other errors. I heard from another friend about a colleague of theirs who'd been invited for a vaccine because of the brain injury they'd suffered, leading to their cerebral atrophy. Except, as far as they were aware, they didn't actually have brain damage.
But her name was Sarah Paul Atrophy. It's just a coincidence.
But there was just a mistake in the medical record. So they called up their doctors to explain there was a mistake in their medical record. And the receptionist was incredibly polite and incredibly friendly and explaining it's okay, you don't have to worry, just go and get the vaccine. Because the receptionist was pretty sure the person they were talking to was brain damaged. And so they're calling up to say, I don't have brain damage. Said, no, honestly, it's absolutely fine. Don't worry about it at all. Just get the vaccine. It's all going to be totally fine. And when I heard both those stories, I actually suggested at the time, given that Liverpool is vaccinating people so quickly and so efficiently at the moment, I wondered whether it might have caused less hassle for the NHS for them to keep that appointment and let that random outlier slide, rather than giving the NHS the headache of having to cancel one appointment, rebook it for somebody else, find someone to be in there, especially if it was the last minute. And so that was on my mind before I ended up being one of those random outliers who got a random text from the GP. And so I decided to book the earliest appointment that I could get to, which was the one at 20 to 5. And so I went along. And I've got to say, I was absolutely hugely impressed by the process of it. It was really, really impressive. They had essentially a large porta cabin built into the car park of like community grounds type thing in Kenny. And you walk up to it in one end and there's a big socially distanced queue. And there's just somebody stood at the front with an iPad, and they ask you your name. They check in there to see that your name was on the list. They tick you off the list and walk you into one of 8 little tiny rooms that they had to the side. While you're in there, there's 2 people in there, one of which gives you like a 2-minute briefing about the safety of the vaccine and that kind of stuff. And at the end, when they're asking you all the questions as to you haven't had a vaccine recently, you've never had an allergic reaction, et cetera, they're inputting it in the computer. They say, right, that all seems fine. And the other person in the room stabs you with a needle. And in and out, I think I was probably in that room about 3 minutes or less, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. You come out of that room, go and sit in a well-ventilated socially distanced waiting area for 10 minutes to make sure that you don't have one of the very, very rare reactions to it. Once your 10 minutes is up, which they write on a piece of paper so you know when to leave, you just leave and you're done. In and out in 15 minutes total. And I was in the vaccination room itself less than 4 minutes, I'd say. It was really impressive. And the thing is, I saw the person come out of that little room before me, and it was literally, right, there's a room free, off you go. So it was just straight in. And then as soon as I left, somebody else came in as well. So they were absolutely hammering through the numbers. It was really, really impressive. I don't think they left any gaps. They had 8 rooms running that way, plus maybe 3 or 4 staff members floating around, getting people to their rooms and making sure everyone in the waiting area was fine. So it was genuinely really, really impressive.
The little speech that you got about the safety of the vaccine, do you think that that's an informed consent thing or a sop to anti-vaxxers thing?
No, it was purely informed consent because it wasn't even that much of a speech about the safety of the vaccine. It was in the sense of, so we're going to give you the vaccine now. We're giving you the Pfizer vaccine. You haven't had an allergic reaction to a vaccine before, have you? Okay, well, and it was that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And it was, we need you to go in the waiting room afterwards for 10 minutes. It was that kind of safety stuff rather than because honestly, they were just business. It was great. They weren't, it wasn't even so much as a, hi, how are you doing? Anything like that. It was just like, hi there.
Which is what you need, isn't it?
Yeah, it was so efficient. It was really, really smooth. It was really great. And I posted this whole kind of story up on social media and actually saw a couple of other people, some of my friends, people I used to work with, someone from Liverpool, a few people not. They'd all said they were in the same boat. They'd been sent the text from the GP as well to say, come and make your appointment. And they'd made appointments and stuff like that. And then I saw on Twitter, there was a journalist from the newspaper iNews, which I think was related to The Independent, who'd been speaking to a handful of people that this has happened to. Young, healthy people who were offered a vaccine seemingly completely out of the official order. And the journalist was asking for other people to talk to and share their experiences. And so I was put in touch with her. And it actually stemmed from a first article they published where they actually claimed the reason these younger people were not being vaccinated earlier was due to vaccination hesitancy in older groups in those areas. But as I say, I don't think that's the case here in Liverpool because 90% of people over the age of 75 have been vaccinated already. 88% of those 70 to 74. And they're working through the remnants and also the 64% of 65 to 69-year-olds. And they're working through people. So they're getting through quite well in Liverpool. Some of the people in that iNews article, the first one, called their doctor to check, should I really be getting this? And they were told, well, just go ahead with the appointment anyway. Not sure why you've been invited, but just go for it anyway. But the iNews journalist Rhiannon Williams was actually one of the people who were first invited, which I suspect is how they got onto this story. And she said she's 32, and she said at first she assumed that she might have something in her health history that she wasn't aware of, which might have pushed her up the list. But when she called to ask her local surgery, they said it was just working its way through its patients in a perfectly normal fashion, and so she should get it.
And I guess for a lot of people, actually checking the medical records is quite tricky. If it's really obvious, oh my God, your BMI is 28,000, as soon as they open up your medical record and see that, they're going to understand why you've been incorrectly, in Liam Thorpe's case, called up for vaccination. But for a lot of people, it would require going through notes and notes of medical records to check that. My medical records are enormous. For a doctor to go through and find what's the reason, they're not always organized very well. You'll see them in appointments looking through my record for information, and they'll be scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. It's not easy to find.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, which I'll come to that in a moment, but that's a really, absolutely.
And of course, the actual receptionists can't open your medical records to get that information. It has to be passed on. I think it has to be passed on to a doctor. I'm not sure where the regulations lie with patient confidentiality, but there's certainly only... It's not going to be as simple as a receptionist just opening your medical record and having a gander. Yeah.
And so I was actually interviewed by the iNews for a follow-up on this story, which is a bit odd that me getting vaccinated was news. That seemed a bit strange to me that I had a vaccine and a couple of days later I'm news. But I tried to explain all the reasoning that I've had there, and most of all I tried to emphasize that the most important thing to me was that the vaccine wasn't wasted. And I was just worried that if I didn't fill that slot, there was a chance, however small, that someone else wouldn't fill it. And I would much rather my vaccine had gone to someone higher up the priority list. But if it's me or nobody, I'd rather it was me. And I also said that I don't think this problem will be fixed by patients phoning up their GP to question the allocation system. I actually think that's going to cause a lot more harm than good, and I'll explain about that in a moment. But the main thing that I stressed to iNews was that it's really, really important that any article they publish about this isn't critical of the vaccine rollout itself, which has been hugely impressive. And definitely that it doesn't give any fuel to anti-vaxxers. And to be fair to them, they were really good about that. I was really glad to see that. The article included my quote saying that how being in the room and seeing how many people who were willing to take it and how brilliantly and efficiently it was all run was really impressive. And I was really encouraged to see it. And I wanted that quote to get in there, so it was really clear that I was saying, guys, everyone's getting the vaccine who gets asked. You guys should all join in as well. I didn't want there to be any hesitancy. Since then, iNews have published another story following this up, where they've confirmed with the head of the NHS rollout that even the reserve list of we've got a slot and we need someone to fill it has to come from the most vulnerable categories only. And anybody who's offered a vaccine who thinks they're not eligible, according to this, the person who's managing the NHS rollout, should assume it's a mistake and should call up their doctor to turn the appointment down. If you don't think you're eligible for it because you don't think you're in one of those categories, you should call up your doctor to get the appointment cancelled. And I'll be honest, I do not think that is a good potential fix. nor is the other idea I saw some people floating that people should be asked at the vaccine centre for ID and for which priority group they fall into.
No, that's terrible. Yeah. Don't do that.
That latter idea, if we handle it first, that's bad for lots of reasons. For one of which being the people least likely to have good photo ID are the ones who are most vulnerable and the most underprivileged backgrounds. You may not have a driver's license if you haven't learned to drive because you couldn't afford to learn to drive. So not everybody will have good ID on them. Not everyone will want to disclose that kind of information in front of a queue as to which group they're in. But also for me, the biggest reason is that people running the vaccine centre don't care and shouldn't care.
Yeah, it's wasting their time, isn't it?
Yeah, they're not. Their job is to move people from the queue to the waiting room via a vaccine and to tick them off the list to make sure they're vaccinated. That's it. Anybody who is on the list is there to be vaccinated according to the list. That's what they're there to handle. And turning anybody away at that stage is a great way to guarantee that you do waste resources that have been allocated to them. If you're turning away even 5 people a day who turn up, then you've got 5 vaccines that were allocated that you're not going to be able to give.
Or even if you do manage to give those 5 vaccines, you've lost 5 time slots that could have been used to give more vaccines.
Yeah.
And we're solving a problem that doesn't exist. There isn't great swathes of people scamming their way into vaccine centres to get an early vaccine. That we need to check that there isn't an issue.
There's occasional mistakes that are made that just means a few people get their vaccine early. It's not at the expense of somebody else necessarily.
Yeah, well, let's have a look at that, right? Because what about that idea of having people check if they think it's a mistake that they were invited and therefore call their doctors and turn it down? I think it's a really bad message to send to people. The UK is currently administering something like 400,000 vaccines per day. How many of those are going to admin pancake men? How many of them are going to admin Tom Thumbs? Or how many of them are going to the not actually brain damage, but it says on my charts? Or how many of those are going to the healthy but available like me? Completely healthy but able to get there quickly. I'd be surprised if it was anywhere near as many as 1,000 per day. 1,000 of those people every single day. I'd be surprised if it was that high. But let's assume it's that high. Even then, that's a fraction of 1% of vaccines that are administered in error. And to be clear, by error, we mean people who need to be vaccinated, but just not yet.
Yeah.
This isn't like a normal medical error. Oh, we've given this medication to the wrong person. It's we've given this medication to the right person, but too early, because we're all going to get vaccinated.
Everyone needs the shot. Yeah.
So let's look first of all at that group of pretend it's 1,000 people who are being prioritized higher than was necessary. Some of those people will receive the text, won't pay any heed to the message that they should assume it's a mistake, and will get vaccinated anyway. So telling people, check it first, won't reach some of those people. The intervention in those papers just isn't going to have an appreciable effect on these error cases. Some of them will check first, and they'll be told to take the appointment anyway. So they've called up their doctor, and as Alice says, they've got to go from the receptionist to the doctor, look through their medical records to confirm whether or not it's fine, and then be told to carry on regardless. I wonder whether that's why the doctors were just saying, yeah, it's fine, because they were aware that checking to see whether you are eligible or not by going through your medical records is going to take much longer and much more time and resources than just saying, it's fine, it's one vaccine. If there's one every now and again that slips through the net, it's not the end of the world. Some will check and they'll find out that they are in error, they won't take the appointment, and then the NHS will need to go away and refill their slot. And maybe that's easy to do. Maybe from that reserve list of people who are in the top 6 categories, they'll easily find someone who can be available at very short notice, especially if the slot that they're cancelling is booked a few days in advance, they've got more chance of it. But when it's a text message at 2:00 for a slot at 2:50, which is one of the options I was offered, I don't know that if I'd have tried to take that slot and then called up and had it cancelled, I don't know that they could have got someone in 50 minutes with that level of kind of questioning in there. I don't know that's going to be possible. I think there's a chance that won't be filled. It's much less likely to be filled if people are calling up to check their medical records first. But of those 1,000 errors that we've estimated, that we've just put a number on randomly per day, you might save as many as half or 2/3 of vaccines that way. So maybe you save 500 vaccines that can go to priority people who wouldn't have been vaccinated that day because of the 1,000 people who've been reached otherwise. And maybe in that 20 to 50 shots of your Pfizer vaccine is going to get wasted because you weren't able to fill those shots. Just guessing at those numbers could be way out there, but those are useful numbers to work with. But now let's look at the other side of it, the people who are eligible for an invitation. That's 399,000 out of 400,000 if we're working with 1,000 errors. Now, some of those people will definitely know they need a shot. They'll be old enough, they won't need to check. Others will have carers who know absolutely they're eligible for a shot. But some will definitely see the messaging of the paper in the newspapers that the text might be a mistake, so you should call your doctor to check. They're going to see that, and they're going to do exactly that.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't need it. I've just got a touch of asthma. I shouldn't be in the priority group. I'm going to call up and check and make sure.
Yeah. And so what percentage of those 399,000 people do you need to be checking it before you're generating tens of thousands of extra phone calls to the NHS every single day, in which you're going to have to go through people's medical records, some of which might be quite complicated, not all, but some. And when some of those calls don't get through, when they reach the answer phone or when it rings out.
I didn't make an appointment because I didn't know what to do because nobody answered the phone, so I just didn't do anything.
Yeah, so you've got people who are on the clinically vulnerable list because they've been told to check, unable to get confirmation, decide not to get vaccinated. Some of them won't even make the call because they'll just remember they read in the newspaper there were a problem with texts inviting them for vaccines, and so they'll assume that theirs is one of those errors. And this is especially true of the vaccine hesitant. If you're already on the fence about whether you're going to get vaccinated or not, this might be the little nudge you need to not get the vaccine. And as chance would have it, complete coincidence, the same day that I was vaccinated, I was on a panel that evening on vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax for the Young Humanist UK. And one of the points made by one of the experts who researches vaccine hesitancy and how to persuade people on the fence, one of the points they made was that convenience is one of the most persuasive factors. If it's really easy to get vaccinated, people will get vaccinated. So I worry that introducing you have to check in case you're not eligible, and especially a call your doctor to check in case you're not eligible, I worry that that'll be the inconvenience that you need to turn vaccine hesitant person who is going to be vaccinated into someone who isn't.
And you weigh that up against, let's say all 1,000 vaccines that we've estimated are going to the wrong person every day. Let's say that's happening every day. One extra day of vaccines makes up for all of that.
Yeah.
You know, we thought it was going to take us 60 days to get through all this. It's going to take us 61.
But not even that, because the people in that 1,000 per day would have been vaccinated anyway. So it's going to take the same amount of time. It's just you're reprioritized.
Indeed.
But take, for example, mental health issues, which puts patients on the list of category 6 vulnerabilities. There's certain mental health issues that do that. That's the category that's likely to be in the reserve list, I think. Because obviously what you're going to do is say, I'm inviting my 1 to 5s for a specific slot, and actually it's got to 2 p.m. I haven't got all my slots filled. Send a message out to the reserve list. So it's priority 6, which includes people who have mental health issues. Now, we know how hard it can be to pick up the phone and call your doctor when you're suffering from things like anxiety and depression. Introducing it's probably not you, so check first. Introducing that step might put people off getting it in a way that booking the online appointment wouldn't. If all you need to do is click the link and make an online appointment, that's going to be much easier than first phoning up your doctor and having that difficult conversation about your health and your mental health to see whether you're on the list or not, and then doing that. So I honestly think the question that needs to be asked here is, what impact would encouraging the public to doubt their eligibility have on the 399,000 people per day who are eligible for vaccinations that we're doing every single day? And would that impact be more or less than the 450 or so vaccines we might save by trying to eliminate some of the clinical errors or NHS trusts straying from the priority list in order to use every single shot? I think we'd lose more than 450 people out of, in terms of an eligible vaccine that doesn't get taken with that messaging, than you'd save from the people who are invited out of order. That's honestly what I think.
I'm minded to agree with you. Even obviously all the figures that we've talked about here are, best guess.
Yeah.
Probably, maybe like this, and they could be off. But I think the rationale you've laid out there, I think, makes sense.
And even with that best guess, I honestly think I've overestimated that 1,000 people are being invited for vaccines erroneously, because we've been vaccinating for 2 months now. So that would be about 60,000 people. And we just haven't seen loads, and the stories seem rare that people are saying that. So I'd be surprised if it's 60,000 people have been vaccinated out of turn of the however many, the 17 million or whatever it is that we've given.
That's a lot of articles in the iNews, isn't it?
Yeah. But even still, if it was 60,000 people, if it was 1,000 a day, 60,000 people out of 18 million or however many that we've vaccinated is still a rounding error.
Yeah.
Ultimately, as I told the iNews, I don't think the solution to this is one we put on the patients. For me, if there are indeed issues with the priority ordering and with NHS trusts deciding to fill their reserve from whoever they can get at the last minute rather than just from the category 6 and above people, if that's not the right way to do it, that has to be on the experts at the NHS to sort out. That's for public health experts to have those conversations within the NHS. if there are people who get vaccinated early because their height is misrecorded on their record or because they've been noted as having a condition they don't actually have, I'd rather that than we give anybody who is hesitant a reason not to take it, or anybody who is struggling a barrier to getting it. All of this might sound really self-serving as a justification for me accepting that vaccine. And to be honest, maybe it is. Maybe it is. Honestly, I wrestled with this before getting vaccinated, and I've wrestled with it constantly since. I go through periods where I feel like I must have been really, really selfish to be so excited about being vaccinated, and I should have just turned it down. Like I allowed my desire to get vaccinated blinker me to really good reason to turn down the invite. That's what I keep feeling about this. But ultimately, I think I'm comfortable with the conclusion that I came to here, that designing the system and ironing out the bumps in the system absolutely cannot rest on patients questioning their eligibility. I think it might stop some of the weird outliers, like I assume I might be, but I can't see a version of that doesn't result in fewer people getting vaccines that they absolutely need and they are eligible for and they absolutely should be getting. And I'd much rather 20, 50, even 100 people are vaccinated a bit early than for a single vaccine to be thrown away or a single vulnerable person to turn down the vaccine because they weren't sure. So, in short, as far as I'm concerned, if you're offered the vaccine and you're able to take it, you should take it as soon as you possibly can.
It has been a week for people with certain set of anatomical features. First, the entire media and Matt Hancock talked about how at-home cervical smear tests were being trialled across London, which is a dangerously inaccurate claim. You can't do a smear test at home. There's no way you can easily find your own cervix, let alone scrape some cells off, as you would need to do for a smear test to be a smear test. What is actually being trialled across London is home viral swabs to test for the virus that can cause cervical cancer, HPV. And the difference between these two types of tests might seem minor, but it's actually really important. I'm not going to rant about it more on this episode because I've ranted all over Twitter and I wrote an article for The Skeptic, so you can check out there why it's important to get this stuff right. But I have been frustrated by this all week. And nothing seems to have changed. Nobody seems to have corrected their wording on anything either.
It was something I was quite surprised about when it came out in the press when it was saying home smear test. And I was like, really? That sounds a really weird and irresponsible thing to do, because that's quite an invasive thing. It's not a nice, simple, like a nasal swab, like a COVID test. But then when I read your big long rant about it, I was like, right, it's not actually a proper smear test. It is a nose COVID thing. Just in a different orifice.
Just in the vagina, yeah.
And I saw sort of the flip side of that as well. I saw people responding to it saying, you see, all of this time we've had this horrible, uncomfortable, awkward, painful procedure, and now they've just got a simple thing you can do at home. And if this was something that was being routinely done to men, we'd have solved this so long ago. And it's just another example. It is another example of healthcare not really favouring women, but it's not the example that you think it is. It's not that they've replaced smear tests.
Yeah, and it's really had a knock-on effect. I've seen a lot of people tweeting about it, and a lot of people thankfully tweeting with the corrections and saying, look, you're phrasing this wrong. But also a lot of people with those views, either that smear tests should be easy and therefore, isn't it awful that we have to have these invasive tests to have them done, or that people are imagining that they will have to do this complicated procedure at home and panicking about that. Or even people thinking that we will now be in a position where women's healthcare isn't as important. You won't even have to see a doctor. The doctors don't want to see you for your screening. You will do it at home instead. And they're trying to get people out of doctors' clinics, when in actual fact, this is purely being trialled as a way to capture people who would otherwise miss getting their regular screening test. They're being sent out to people who've missed their call for appointment and are otherwise not going to get tested, because not having a smear test or not having a screening appointment is one of the biggest indicators for going on to develop cervical cancer. Obviously, not everybody who misses their smear test will go on to have cervical cancer, but you're much more likely because you're not being screened, because we know that screening works with cervical cancer. Next, the UK government decided that it would describe pregnant ministers particularly, as mothers, which again is problematically inaccurate. Please do not tell a person what they should be called if they are pregnant. I don't want children. If I ever get pregnant, calling me a mother would be deeply inaccurate. And it's often then used as a tool by people who are against a medical abortion to try and manipulate women into enduring an unwanted pregnancy. Calling pregnant people isn't just about being inclusive to trans people, though it absolutely should be enough. It's also about being inclusive to anyone who might be pregnant but does not identify with motherhood.
Yeah.
I am a woman and a people. Please don't take my personhood away from me and other women by insisting pregnant people are mothers. Some pregnant people are mothers, and you should absolutely call those people mothers if they want to be called mothers, but don't presume you know the circumstances for all people. So on top of that, I had already decided that this week I would talk about a medical condition that affects predominantly women, not just women, but there are important things to consider relating to the anatomy to consider, and it is a condition that affects a lot of women and people with vaginas. So I want to talk about urinary tract infections, which I think is one of those things that should be talked about more because they're really, really common. And we often don't talk about them and keep them quiet, as we tend to do about things that affect the genitals or that sort of area, or anything that we think is embarrassing or anything like that. A urinary tract infection is usually a bacterial infection of the urinary tract, either the lower portion of the urethra and up to the bladder, or the higher portion right the way up to the kidneys. They can affect pretty much anyone, but they are more common in people with vaginas because the urethra, the tube that connects the bladder to the outside world, is much shorter, and the bacteria are more able to make their way up from the entrance of the urethra up to the bladder and beyond. They're also more common in people using catheters and older people. 50% of women will have a UTI in their lifetime, and 10 to 20% of women will get recurrent UTIs, which is 2 or more in a 6-month window in their lifetime. They're pretty uncommon in younger, healthy men. If you have a penis and you have a UTI, there's probably something else going on that has caused you to have that UTI. They tend to be a bit more complicated and more serious because they're less common. Symptoms can vary depending on where the infection has reached, but even the minor symptoms can be pretty awful. And I think this is something we don't talk about a lot. I went through a phase of getting UTIs quite a lot, and we'll come back specifically to recurrent UTIs later. But it means I have some experience of how the symptoms can be. So using my own experience, for me, they range from a desperate need to pee, even when your bladder is empty, which has led to me spending basically hours on the toilet. They can cause a burning sensation when you pee, which is extra cruel when you have the sense of needing to pee a lot, because the act of peeing is physically painful. And that can be a relatively minor pain, or it can be such a bad pain that in my case, I've been hunched over and physically shaking because it can be a really severe pain. And these are what we would consider to be the minor symptoms, but even those can make working pretty difficult if you're glued to the toilet and can't make it through meetings because you need to pee so often. You usually also get cloudy pee, and sometimes you will see blood in your pee or when you wipe, plus pain in your lower abdomen or lower back. Your temperature might be elevated or low. You might feel shaky and shivery. And if the infection reaches the kidneys, you can have really bad pains in your lower back and down the flanks. UTIs can also cause severe exhaustion as your body fights off the infection. I've had some infections where I'm so lethargic I just need to nap on the sofa for a few days until it clears out. They can also cause you to be a bit confused, which is hugely amplified in older people, particularly with dementia. So it can be really hard to identify UTIs in people with dementia, but it very frequently comes with a sudden worsening of their memory or other cognitive functions, which can be really scary for families who are caring for someone with dementia, that their loved one has suddenly got worsening dementia symptoms.
Is there a known mechanism for that? Because that seems a peculiar side effect. Is it just the general stress on the rest of the body that causes the exacerbation of the mental health symptoms, or?
I'm not sure, I've not really looked into it, but I guess it would make sense that you're taking a lot of energy into fighting off the infection, and it makes your brain a little bit confused. And also, I guess you've kind of got all sorts of anti-inflammatories running through your body. But I haven't looked into it. For
some reason, I assumed it was more of a kind of a dehydration-y type thing, but I don't know.
You don't always have dehydration with UTIs, and dehydration. So yes, dehydration can cause a factor that influences whether you get UTIs, and you can be dehydrated if you have a UTI, but not always. It's not always the case. But UTIs are pretty common in people with dementia too. So it's not a fun infection to have, but it is pretty treatable. You see a doctor, they will test your urine for the presence of blood and bacteria and prescribe you some antibiotics, and then it usually clears up within a couple of days. The best thing you can do if you have a UTI, which is the hardest thing to do when it hurts to pee, is drink loads of water. Keeping hydrated helps flush the system and wash out the bacteria, and eventually it makes peeing less painful. But it's the worst. When you wake up in the middle of the night, knowing that you've woken up with, and it seems to always be in the middle of the night, I wake up in the middle of the night knowing that I have a UTI. It's such a recognizable feeling when you have it. Like you just know. Sitting on the loo thinking, I need to go and get a pint of water, and the last thing I want to do right now is do something that will cause me to need to pee again in an hour's time. The NHS website doesn't actually recommend that you see a doctor right away. You should wait 2 days to see if it improves on its own, unless you have other factors that increase your need to see a doctor. I think if you've got a fever, if you're a man, a few other reasons that you would see a doctor immediately. But in most cases, you would wait for a few days to see if it improves on its own. And they also say that a doctor might not actually prescribe an antibiotic. They might give you advice on how to manage the symptoms at home and see if it goes away before giving you an antibiotic. In reality, for me, every time I've seen a doctor or nurse for a UTI, they prescribe an antibiotic, which does have consequences for people with recurrent UTIs. And they're always really quick to do it. So it's pretty much, I go in, I say, I think I've got a UTI. They pretty much take my word for it. They will take a urine sample and they will do a dipstick test. But they know pretty much that women and people with vaginas who've had UTIs before, they know what a UTI feels like, and they will go in and say, I've got a UTI, and the doctor will just pretty much prescribe you antibiotics, in my experience. So I'm going to talk about my experience as an example, because I think it's illustrative. So a few years ago, I started getting frequent UTIs. I had never had a UTI before, and then suddenly I was getting them every few months. And every time I would go to the doctor, they would sample my urine. They would tell me that they couldn't see signs of bacteria, but there was blood in my urine, so they would prescribe me an antibiotic. Periodically, they would send a sample off for testing, and then I would get a text message back saying that my white blood cell count was elevated, indicating I was fighting off an infection, but if I felt better by the time I got the result, not to worry about it. They would find blood in my urine, and that was basically it, white blood cells.
But nothing indicating that they'd actually cultured a bacteria out of your sample.
No, they never really told me anything about the bacteria they found. They would just repeat this over and over again every few months. So I never actually knew that I definitely had a bacterial infection. Eventually, I got sick of being sick so often. So I raised it with the doctor that I was getting loads of these infections and that wasn't normal for me. So could we do some investigations? And the guidance is that if you're getting recurrent UTIs, you should be forwarded on to see a specialist, but you kind of get lost. And the reality of going through healthcare systems is you get lost because you contact them saying, I think I've got a UTI. If you've got a UTI, they will refer you to a GP, but they might actually just refer you to a nurse practitioner because it's a pretty simple thing to diagnose and treat. And you might see a different nurse practitioner 5 different times. You might see a different GP 5 different times. It's something they just want to deal with quite quickly. In which case, nobody's actually noticing, hang on, this patient's had 5 UTIs in a year. We should probably get them checked out.
Yeah.
So you have to be the one to bring it up, which shouldn't necessarily be the case, but certainly was the case for me and has been the case for other people that I know who've had recurrent UTIs. But eventually I did bring it up to them and say, look, this isn't normal for me. Can we do some tests? And I was referred to a urologist. The urologist did loads of fun tests. I was in their clinic for like half a day. They made me drink loads of water and then measure how I pee, the strength of the flow. And they checked that I was emptying my bladder fully because retaining urine can increase the risk of UTIs, and a strong flow helps to flush the bacteria out of the urethra. They also stuck a scope all the way into my bladder and showed me all the patches of inflammation on the inside of my bladder.
Yeah, not keen on that, like.
I love that sort of stuff. I think that's dead cool. It's like, I can see the inside of my bladder. It's brilliant.
It's not a movie you'd pay to see, but, I suppose if it's there.
I find medical tests interesting. I said to you when you were getting vaccinated, can you take photos and tell me about the whole experience? Because I find this stuff fascinating.
Yeah.
I want to know.
I didn't take any photos just because it was such a whistle-stop thing.
But they didn't find any signs of anything that was specifically causing the infections. The urologist said she thought that my bladder wasn't healing properly between infections, which meant that I was more prone to getting fresh ones. But she also looked through my previous test results, and though many of them never actually found any bacteria, one of the very early ones found some antibiotic-resistant bacteria. In my case, my UTIs aren't sex-related. For an awful lot of people with vaginas, they are linked to penetrative sex. I think it's something like 70% of cases it is common, but for me, that's not the cause. So one way to help treat people who have recurrent UTIs that are sex-related is for them to take antibiotics whenever they have sex for a few months until they get out of the cycle, because of that idea that damage to the bladder can increase your risk. They do have another option for people who have recurrent UTIs in that you can take a low level of antibiotics constantly for 3 to 6 months, again, so that your bladder has time to heal. You're killing any bacteria until you're healed, and then hopefully you get out of that cycle of getting recurrent UTIs. For me, sex isn't a cause, and there was an indication of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, so these options weren't necessarily good options for me. So my urologist made a few recommendations. The first was to try and avoid taking antibiotics for 6 months. If I had an infection, I was to try and ride it out, drink loads of fluids, pee as often as possible, keep the area clean. I went through a phase of using a warm flannel after every time I peed, partly to make sure to remove any bacteria and partly because it was soothing when things were inflamed.
What's the rationale behind that, though, behind avoiding antibiotic use? How would that help with antibiotic-resistant bacterial infection?
So a big part of the recommendation to not take antibiotics is one thing that can keep the bacteria that cause UTIs in check is to keep healthy bacteria, vaginal flora and bacteria that you would usually have in your system that help keep those bacteria in check. By taking antibiotics, you're wiping out everything.
Right.
And your body's not naturally doing the job that it should be doing.
Yeah, don't scare away the guard dogs.
Yeah.
So her idea was, if we can get you to 6 months without taking antibiotics, you should have built up enough of your own good bacteria to be able to fight these off itself. And part of the issue is I was in this cycle of damaged bladder, no good bacteria, and that was increasingly the likelihood of infections.
That sounds like you were saying your bacteria was no good, like gosh darn no good bacteria.
The other things that she recommended, things like drinking loads of fluid, peeing frequently, peeing straight after sex, keeping the area clean.
Injecting Yakult into your bladder, things like that.
Those things are also recommendations for preventing UTIs. So they're good rules for vagina ownership in general. These are things that if you've got a vagina, you should try to do. Funnily enough, I've always drunk loads. There is no concern that dehydration is causing UTIs for me. I don't know why. It's not for any particular reason, but I typically drink about 4 litres of fluid in a day on an average day. And sometimes way more, sometimes like 6 to 8 litres. I drink loads and loads of liquid.
Is that all water? Is some of that tea? What's your liquid composition?
I drink between 3 and 4 pints of squash every day.
Okay.
And then I'll usually have 3 coffees during the day in like this giant mug that I have, a giant coffee mug.
Well, just for listeners, we're getting a shot of Alice's giant mug here. It is a giant mug. That is a very large mug. That is a chunky mug.
So I'll have 3 of those, 3 or 4 pints of squash, and then I will have, in the evening, I'll have maybe 2 cups of tea and something else, maybe a glass of pop, maybe a glass of wine, some other fluid over the evening. So I'll usually have about 3 additional drinks in the evening as well of some varied composition. So it's mostly water.
I would take issue with your massive mug, though, because I think you've got a fool's mug. You've got a mug's mug. Because you've gone massive wide rather than massive tall, which means more surface area. It's going to go cold really quickly.
I like cold coffee. You know this about me. I drink my coffee cold most of the time.
Weird. It's weird.
I drink my tea and my coffee cold most of the time.
That's because you drink from such a wide mug. It's the other way around.
Stone cold by the time you're back to your desk.
Yeah.
It does stay warm long enough, but I quite frequently forget I'm drinking a cup of coffee and will just then drink it literally stone cold, and people pull faces because it's really weird to drink stone cold tea and coffee, but I do drink stone cold tea and coffee.
It's like you're drinking it off a dinner plate.
I quite like stone cold tea. Cold tea is quite nice.
It's wide and not very deep. It's a dinner plate. You're slurping it off a dinner plate.
Famously a saucer, how you cool your drink down.
It's not shallow, like it's deep as well. It is just particularly a wide mug. It's a mug. It's a proper mug. Like, it is mug-shaped.
Yeah, nobody drinks a cup of tea, do they? It's a mug of tea.
Yeah.
You drink a mug of tea. A cup of tea is not enough tea. And the handle's too small to get your fingers in.
Yeah,
I've never understood that. I've never understood why you'd need like an espresso cup as well, where the handles are so small that you fingertips only. It's ridiculous to me.
I've got some pretty espresso cups that have got stars on them, but mainly just sit on my kitchen side decoratively. And occasionally I'll make a pot of espresso and use them to drink that and feel very fancy. So it made sense to me. No antibiotics for 6 months to prevent the buildup of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, but also to help allow my good bacteria to regrow and allow my body to do its thing and keep things running as normal. So avoiding antibiotics had a logical and scientifically reasonable background to me. It made perfect sense. But then she made another recommendation. And she knew I was a scientist, because they always ask you, it's the first thing any specialist, having seen a lot of specialists, this is what specialists do. When they first take your history, that history includes like knowing what your job is, and they ask about you. So they always know what my job is. So she knew I was a scientist, and she caveated heavily what she was saying, but she explained that I could try 2 things that there was some evidence for, but not quite enough yet. So she recommended I take a supplement called D-Mannose, and she recommended I take a daily probiotic. The idea behind the probiotic is, again, to help build up the good bacteria, which have been wiped out by taking the antibiotics so frequently for a while. And the idea behind the D-Mannose, she explained, was to make it harder for the bacteria to cling on to the inside of the urethra.
How do you take this?
Just a tablet.
Okay, fair enough. It's not like a spray, like vandalism paint.
We will come back to pessaries. But no, the D-Mannose is just an oral supplement that you take. It's a sugar.
I have heard of D-Mannose as a treatment for UTIs. One of my partners a long time ago struggled with long-term recurrent UTIs, and that was one of the things that was suggested to her at the time.
And actually, any time that I've mentioned anywhere on social media that I'm struggling with recurrent UTIs, which is not necessarily something I mention a lot, but anytime I have mentioned it, somebody from my social past has got in touch with me to say they started taking D-Mannose and that's the thing that worked for them. Like, anecdotally, there's some really strong support for it, but
20,000 listeners just bristled.
But, you know, for some of these things, that's actually important. And I'll come back to it. But, you know, there's not much medical guidance on what can be done for recurrent UTIs if you don't want to take antibiotics. And so sometimes having a recommendation, as long as it's not a harmful thing, as long as it's something that is relatively harmless, not too expensive, easy to take, I'm very happy to give those things a try and see if it helps. If it does, great. If it doesn't, no, nothing lost, really. D-Mannose you can buy on Amazon pretty cheap and get enough tablets to give you a good few months worth of a go on it. And it's not, there's no evidence that it will cause you any real harm. So the idea is that D-Mannose is a sugar. It binds to mannose receptors, and these receptors line the surface of the cells on the inside of the urethra. And those receptors are something that sugars on the surface of bacteria use to cling on to the cells. And that can prevent the bacteria being washed out by urination. So the idea is that if those receptors are already bound to the D-Mannose, then the bacteria can't bind to them because the receptors are no longer available for binding and they get washed out more easily. And competitive binding is a thing that we use a lot in understanding like how things work in the body. And this is exactly what this is. The idea is you've competitively bound to those receptors so the bacteria can't bind. But neither probiotics nor D-Mannose are available for prescription for recurrent UTIs on the NHS. So when my urologist told me to take both, I was a little skeptical and did some research. And it's actually a while ago now. It's only because you asked me about it recently, Mike, that I thought to actually talk about it on the podcast. A National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, report, so this is the body that recommends what doctors should do for conditions, amongst other things. They wrote a report. They considered the evidence for a few different things for the treatment of recurrent UTIs. And we are talking specifically recurrent UTIs here. They considered D-Mannose, probiotics, another common recommendation of cranberry products, and estrogen supplementation for postmenopausal recurrent UTIs. For probiotics, NICE considered 2 meta-analyses. The first considered 5 studies of non-pregnant women taking probiotics or placebo. 4 of the studies were using vaginal pessaries to administer the probiotic, and 1 used a drink formulation taken orally, not a drink formulation that they recommended that they paste inside themselves. And they found no real difference between probiotics and placebo unless they selected for what they determined as effective strains, in which case there was a statistically significant reduction in recurrent infections with probiotics compared to placebo. So there's some evidence, and it's not fantastic evidence, but there is some evidence that if you find the right probiotic and you take it regularly, it might help reduce your risk of recurrent infections. It's not strong evidence. It's not reliable enough that you should be doing it in place of antibiotics. But if you're in a position where you can't or don't want to take antibiotics, it might be an option to try. There has been more data since then, which I'll come to in a minute. Since then, NICE now give the guidance that the data on probiotics is inconclusive, and that in their recommendation for recurrent UTIs, they say that if patients want to take probiotics, they should be told that the data for their efficacy is inconclusive. So there's a bit of data that it works. There's a bit of data that it doesn't work. On balance, it probably means if there's an effect, it's quite a small effect, but every human's slightly different. And it might be that for some people, it might help a little bit. The second meta-analysis looked at patients taking probiotics compared to antibiotics, and there was no benefit, which makes sense. Antibiotics are actually killing the bacteria. For D-Mannose, some evidence that NICE considers high quality suggests that D-Mannose is significantly better than no treatment in reducing the number of recurrent infections, but is not better than antibiotic use. So again, if you're in a position where you can't or don't want to take antibiotics, but are having recurrent infections, then it might be something to try for some people. And that difference, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's 14% on D-Mannose get recurrent infections and 60% who aren't taking D-Mannose get recurrent infections. So there is a difference. For cranberry products, again, only 3 studies were considered, a meta-analysis and 2 randomized controlled trials. But the findings suggested that cranberry products are not better than placebo, antibiotics, or no treatment in reducing the number of recurrent infections. But one study did report that there was a statistically significant reduction in antibiotic-resistant infections in people taking cranberry products. So it might not reduce your risk of getting infections, but it might reduce the risk that those infections are resistant to antibiotics. And there is some more recent evidence that suggests cranberry products, particularly capsules, do reduce the risk of recurrent UTIs. I think the nature of the studies giving conflicting results suggests that if there is an effect of cranberry products, it's a small one. But it is proposed to help in a similar way to D-Mannose by preventing bacteria binding to the wall of urethra. So I think there's some plausibility, and there is some evidence that it might be beneficial if you're taking capsules. I think probably D-Mannose is better, so why bother?
And that's interesting, because what I observe just anecdotally from people that I know is people will take cranberry for an acute infection. They don't take it to prevent an infection. I've got a UTI, I'm going to start drinking cranberry juice for a couple of weeks until it settles down again. Yeah,
and that's what a lot of people do, yeah. And actually, if it's going to have any effect, it's going to be preventing bacteria from establishing in your system, because it's preventing them from binding to the wall of the urethra. For estrogen treatments in postmenopausal people, the idea is that when your estrogen drops, so does your vaginal flora, so you're at an increased risk of UTIs. And they found that topical vaginal estrogen did help reduce the rate of recurrent infection. So currently, the NICE guidelines for recurrent UTIs for non-pregnant people with vaginas is to recommend vaginal estrogen for postmenopausal people, offer self-care advice, and then offer antibiotics if the infection doesn't clear up. They say that some people may wish to take probiotics, D-Mannose, or cranberry products. They should be told that the evidence for probiotics is inconclusive and that D-Mannose or cranberry products contain sugar that should be accounted for in your daily intake. But really, that's it. People are told to try to maintain good hygiene, peeing after sex and drinking plenty. For premenopausal people with vaginas, they're offered antibiotics, and that's it. In my case, I took D-Mannose and I tried to avoid antibiotic use for more than 6 months, and eventually I seemed to have broken my run of recurrent UTIs. I did have to go through a few without any treatment, but luckily they cleared up on their own, so I didn't have to go and get antibiotics. But my treatment was not one that is recommended by NICE, maybe I would have been okay to take low levels of antibiotics for a few months. Maybe that evidence of resistant bacteria wasn't a problem and I could have taken the antibiotics for a few months. But really, taking antibiotics regularly isn't fun. But it wipes out your gut bacteria. It wipes out any other bacteria. It means you're more likely to have diarrhea, problems with digestion, all sorts of like nasty side effects that are not fun to live through if you're going to have to take them for 3 to 6 months. And they set you in a position where you are more vulnerable to other opportunistic infections because you've not got any good bacteria helping. So I'm glad I didn't take them. I'm glad I followed this treatment plan. It might not have been that the D-Mannose, I actually did D-Mannose and probiotics and tried to avoid antibiotic use. It could just be that giving my body a chance to build its own bacteria without antibiotic use was the only thing that helped. Or it could have been that the woo that I was taking actually helped. And I have no idea. But I am now in a position where I'm not getting regular recurrent UTIs. I've had one in the last year. But really, I think from researching this, it's clear that we haven't prioritized doing enough research on the alternative options for people with recurrent UTIs, even though recurrent UTIs are not all that uncommon. And that means there's a lot of women and people with vaginas who are dealing with the frustration of being repeatedly sick and sometimes really very sick with little advice or support. It's no wonder people turn to old wives' tales like drinking cranberry juice.
So, Marsh, a new episode of Be Reasonable was recently published. Do you want to give us a lowdown on that?
Yeah, last week we put out the re-interview of Darren Nesbitt, which I think was a really interesting interview. I've had a lot of kind of good feedback on it. But Darren Nesbitt, who originally was on the show as a flat earther in 2018, 2019, I had him back on to talk more about his COVID protests, his lockdown protests, his anti-mask marches, and the role he's playing in all those communities. And we got into some pretty interesting areas about how he didn't believe viruses are real. He believes in exome theory of viruses instead, that what we're detecting as viruses is actually just detritus ejected from an unhealthy cell, and lots of other stuff. So yeah, it was a wide-ranging conversation, and I think I could have talked to him for another 6 hours and done the entire year's worth of shows with him. But I hope listeners enjoy it.
Is he the first returning guest that we've ever had? Someone who's come back for more?
Yeah, he is. Yeah, I think so.
The first time that's happened. That's good. Maybe we'll get him on 3 times. maybe that's what we'll do. Get him back again.
We'll see where he goes next.
And Alice, what's going on with Skeptics in the Pub Online?
So I will tell you about 2 events that we have coming up because the next ones fall under the next SWAC. So this week, as of the day this episode goes out at 7 p.m, at twitch.tv/SITP, Dr. Marianne Fisher will be talking about the myth of the maternal instinct and all about evolution and things like that. And then the following week, which is March the 11th, again at 7 p.m. at twitch.tv/SITP, Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris will be talking about the end of denialism and talking about the danger of different types of denialism and debunking denialist claims.
And you'll find that at twitch.tv/SITP, yeah?
Yep.
And Marsh, the Skeptic. How are we doing at the Skeptic?
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff being published there. Alice's piece about HPV swabs not being home smear test, for example, is one of the things that's there that people should absolutely check out. We also had a piece from Mark Horn about the new Chariot of the Gods theme park that's being planned for Blackpool, and actually what the Chariots of the Gods books are really based on, and how they are essentially perpetuate fairly, unfortunately, racist assumptions about what people around the world could achieve if they weren't white. So there's a really interesting piece on that I know has been getting quite a lot of attention on the site. And Tiago from Brazil, our regular writer on conspiracy theory, has written an article we published yesterday all about where the QAnon movement and the sovereign citizen movement are going now and how they've coalesced around what they believe is going to happen today in America on March the 4th.
Blimey. Okay. And so, listeners, if you're interested, you can go to skeptic.org.uk to read more about what's going on at Skeptic magazine. We're publishing stuff on a regular basis. And just a reminder for listeners about the Merseyside Skeptics Patreon. So Merseyside Skeptics, we run a Patreon. That is how we fund the things that we do at Merseyside Skeptics. It's how we fund this podcast. and indeed the other podcasts that we publish. So aside from Be Reasonable that Marsh has already mentioned, we also publish another podcast called Incredulous, which is a comedy panel show produced and presented by Andy Wilson. We put a couple of episodes of that out recently, actually, we with the two specials that we've done recently, the lockdown specials that we've done recently. So that's episode 49 and episode 50 of Incredulous were published quite recently, and you can find those in all of the places that you can get podcasts from. But that's all funded by our Patreon, including this show. So if you can see your way clear to just throwing us, £1 is fine. Just throw a donation in, and you can do that at patreon.com/Mercy Skeptics. We really appreciate that. Aside from that, then, I think that is all we've got time for.
I think so.
All that remains then is for me to thank Marsh for coming on today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to Alice.
Thank you.
We have been Skeptics with a K, and we will see you next time.
Bye now.
Bye.
Skeptics with a K is a production of the Merseyside Skeptics Society. For more information, visit our website, www.merseysideskeptics.org.uk, or email podcast@merseysideskeptics.org.uk.